They didn't need chains anymore. They didn't need slave patrols or whips. According to Malcolm X, power in America had learned a new language and spoken through uniforms, courtrooms, and silence. In one of his boldest messages to the nation, Malcolm X confronted a truth many were afraid to say out loud. Police violence against Black Americans was not accidental, isolated, or misunderstood. It was built into the structure itself, a system that claimed to protect freedom, yet repeatedly failed to protect Black lives. A system where justice was promised in theory, but often denied in practice. Malcolm's words cut through illusion. He asked a question that still echoes today. What kind of democracy exists when one group has no real voice, no real protection, and no real power inside the system meant to serve everyone? His message wasn't about chaos or hatred, it was about clarity, about recognizing patterns, about refusing to accept narratives that blamed victims while excusing institutions. This wasn't a speech meant to comfort. It was meant to awaken. Malcolm X spoke to those who felt invisible, unheard, and exhausted from waiting. He challenged them to look beyond slogans and ask who truly benefits from law and order when the law is unevenly applied. He warned that silence was not neutrality, it was permission. That's why this message was feared, and that's why it still matters. In this video, we revisit Malcolm X's most powerful word swords that challenge myths, expose contradictions, declare, and demand honest reflection. Not to divide, but to understand. Not to provoke, but to reveal. If you believe history should be told without distortion, if you value voices that speak truth even when it's uncomfortable, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who want to understand the deeper story behind America's struggle for justice. This is not just history. This is a warning and a wake-up call. That awakening did not come from comfort or privilege. It was forged in loss, isolation, and long nights spent questioning a world that had offered him little mercy. Before Malcolm X became a voice that challenged America's conscience, he was Malcolm Little, a child shaped by forces far larger than himself. His earliest memories were not of safety or stability, but of fear and disruption. His father, a strong advocate for Black self-reliance, died under circumstances that left deep scars, and his mother, overwhelmed by pressure and grief, was later separated from her children. By the time Malcolm reached adulthood, the foundations of his life had already been fractured. As a young man, he searched for belonging and recognition in a society that seemed determined to deny both. He drifted, made destructive choices, and eventually found himself behind prison walls, a place designed to erase identity rather than restore it. Yet it was there, in confinement and silence, that something unexpected happened. Cut off from the noise of the outside world, Malcolm encountered ideas that forced him to rethink everything he had been taught about himself, his history, and his place in America. He began to read with an intensity that surprised even him, devouring books on history, philosophy, and language, slowly rebuilding his mind word by word. Prison did not simply educate Malcolm. It transformed him. Through study and reflection, he discovered the depth of a past that had been hidden from him and a sense of dignity that had long been denied. His conversion to the Nation of Islam offered him a framework to understand his pain, not as personal failure, but as the result of a larger system that had shaped generations before him. More importantly, it gave him discipline, purpose, and a language powerful enough to confront the forces he had once internalized. When Malcolm emerged from prison, he was no longer searching for approval. He spoke with clarity, confidence, and conviction, not to ask for acceptance, but to demand recognition of humanity. His voice carried the weight of lived experience, sharpened by study and strengthened by belief. He did not speak in abstractions. He spoke in realities people recognized but rarely heard articulated so directly. Where others offered patience, he offered urgency. Where others asked for gradual change, he spoke of self-respect, self-knowledge, and self-determination. This transformation is what made Malcolm X impossible to ignore. He was not repeating slogans or echoing comfortable narratives. He was redefining the conversation itself. Black pride, in his message, was not about superiority, but survival. Self-determination was not a threat, but a necessity for dignity. He challenged people to see themselves not through the lens of limitation, but through the lens of potential, rooted in history, culture, and collective strength. The power of Malcolm's message lay in its unity with his life's story. His critique of injustice carried authority because it came from someone who had experienced the system at its harshest levels. His call for awareness resonated because it was born from ignorance overcome, not inherited wisdom. The same system he later condemned had once defined him, confined him, and attempted to silence him, yet it failed to break his capacity to think, learn, and rise. This journey gave coherence to everything he later said. His words about justice, identity, and freedom were not theoretical positions, but conclusions drawn from experience, reflection, and transformation. And formation. Understanding where Malcolm X came from is essential to understanding why his message carried such force, and why it continues to challenge listeners to question not only society, but themselves. As Malcolm X's voice grew stronger, his focus widened beyond individual awakening towards something far more difficult and far more powerful: unity. Having witnessed how division weakened communities from the inside, he understood that no lasting change could come from fragmented efforts. The injustices he spoke about were not selective, and neither, he argued, should the response be. Whether people prayed in different ways, voted for different parties, or came from different neighborhoods, they were being shaped by the same forces and facing the same barriers. To fight separately was to fight at a disadvantage. Malcolm spoke to people who had been taught to define themselves by labels that kept them apart. Religious identity, customs as political affiliation, and social status had become lines of separation, often encouraged by those who benefited from disunity. He challenged this pattern not by dismissing belief or identity, but by placing them in proper context. Faith, he argued, belonged to the private sphere of conscience and spirituality, while the struggle for dignity, safety, and opportunity belonged to everyone. When these were confused, unity became impossible. When they were separated, cooperation became achievable. His storytelling often returned to a simple observation. People were not facing hardship because of their denomination or party, but because of the condition imposed upon them. Discrimination did not ask for religious credentials, nor did inequality check political membership. It reached across all lines, affecting families in the same ways regardless of their internal differences. Malcolm urged people to see this shared experience not as a weakness, but as the foundation for collective strength. Recognition, he believed, was the first step toward coordination. This call for unity was not sentimental or naive. Malcolm was deeply aware of internal disagreements and historical tensions, yet he insisted that survival demanded discipline. He often used the metaphor of family, emphasizing that disagreements handled in private did not weaken a household, but broadcasting them to the outside world did. His message was not to deny differences, but to manage them wisely, without allowing them to overshadow common goals. Public division, in his view, only reinforced existing power structures. What made this message compelling was its global perspective. Malcolm did not frame unity as an abstract ideal, but as a proven strategy. He pointed to moments in history where oppressed groups succeeded, not because they were identical, but because they recognized a shared condition and acted accordingly. When people stopped arguing over internal distinctions and focused on the systems shaping their lives, they gained leverage. Unity transformed vulnerability into influence. In linking unity to dignity, Malcolm shifted the emotional center of the struggle. Cooperation was not merely strategic. It was an assertion of self-respect. Refusing to be divided was a way of reclaiming control over identity and direction. He warned that constant internal conflict drained energy that could otherwise be used to build, organize, and protect communities. Unity, in this sense, was not passive agreement, but active alignment. This theme fits seamlessly into Malcolm's broader journey. Having reconstructed himself through knowledge and discipline, he now challenged others to do the same collectively. The same clarity that had reshaped his life was now being offered as a framework for shared progress. Unity, he argued, did not erase individuality. It gave it purpose within a larger movement. Through this lens, unity became more than a slogan. It became a method, a mindset, and a necessity. Malcolm X's insistence on collective action was not rooted in ideology alone, but in observation, experience, and a clear understanding of power. His message remains a reminder that real change rarely begins with agreement on everything, but with recognition of what truly matters most. As unity began to take shape in Malcolm X's vision, he pushed the conversation further, challenging not only how people stood together, but what they were actually standing for. He was deeply skeptical of change that looked impressive on the surface, yet left the foundations untouched. To Malcolm, progress measured only by words, gestures, or limited concessions was not progress at all, but delay disguised as achievement. He warned that a system could absorb reform without ever surrendering power, offering symbols in place of substance while preserving the same underlying structure. Malcolm spoke carefully about the meaning of revolution, knowing that the word itself was often misunderstood or casually used. History, he argued, gave the term a clear definition. A true revolution was not polite, slow, or conditional. It did not depend on approval from those who benefited from the status quo. Instead, it reshaped ownership, authority, and control. Anything less, in his view, was not transformation, but adjustment. Reform might reduce pressure, but it rarely removed the cause of suffering. This distinction mattered because many people had been taught to celebrate milestones without questioning their limits. Malcolm challenged his listeners to ask what had truly changed when new laws existed on paper but daily reality remained the same. If opportunity was promised but never delivered, if participation was encouraged but power remained out of reach, then the appearance of inclusion masked continued exclusion. He believed that symbolic victories could be dangerous precisely because they created the illusion of resolution while discouraging deeper demands. His perspective was shaped by experience rather than theory. Having seen how easily attention could be redirected by temporary gains, Malcolm urged vigilance. He understood that systems rarely collapse under pressure alone. They adapt when confronted. So, they often offer compromise not to empower, but to stabilize themselves. Malcolm cautioned that celebrating such moments too early risked mistaking patience for progress and restraint for success. This did not mean Malcolm rejected all change that came in stages. What he rejected was the idea that freedom could be delivered incrementally without altering who held control. For him, the core question was always the same: who decides, who benefits, and who bears the cost? If those answers remained unchanged, then reform served as maintenance, not liberation. A revolution, by contrast, redefined relationships between people and power. His message resonated because it aligned with his broader emphasis on awareness and responsibility. Just as he had urged individuals to reclaim their identity and communities to unite, he now demanded intellectual honesty about the nature of change. He asked people to look beyond headlines and examine outcomes. Were lives safer, opportunities broader, and dignity protected, or had expectations simply been managed? In framing revolution this way, Malcolm was not glorifying disruption for its own sake. He was insisting on integrity. True freedom, he believed, required courage to confront uncomfortable truths, including the limits of what was being offered as progress. Without structural change, reforms risked becoming tools of pacification rather than empowerment. This argument completed a critical arc in Malcolm's storytelling. Awakening led to unity. Unity demanded purpose, and purpose required clarity about the destination. Reform without transformation could not fulfill that journey. Malcolm X's insistence on distinguishing between the two remains one of his most enduring contributions, reminding listeners that freedom is not measured by promises made, but by power redistributed and realities changed. Having drawn clear lines between awakening, unity, and genuine transformation, Malcolm X turned his attention to the question that followed naturally: what real control looked like in everyday life. For him, freedom could not survive as an idea alone. It had to be practiced, built, and sustained within the spaces where people lived. Political awareness and moral clarity meant little, he argued, if communities remained dependent on forces that did not share their interests. Power, in its most practical form, was exercised through decisions about leadership, resources, and opportunity. Malcolm spoke about political control, not as a slogan, but as a matter of responsibility. Communities, he believed, had to understand how politics shaped their daily reality, from housing and education to employment and public services. Without this understanding, people were easily persuaded to support leaders who did not represent them or protect their interests. He challenged listeners to move beyond symbolic participation and toward informed engagement, where choices were made with collective well-being in mind rather than empty promises. This political maturity, in Malcolm's view, was inseparable from economic independence. He observed that communities lacking control over their own economy were constantly vulnerable, regardless of how passionately they spoke about rights. When money flowed outward and never returned, neighborhoods weakened, opportunities disappeared, and dependence deepened. Malcolm described this cycle not to shame, but to illuminate how invisible systems shaped visible outcomes. Poverty, he argued, was often the result of extraction rather than inability. Through storytelling, he painted a picture of neighborhoods filled with activity yet drained of benefit, where businesses thrived during the day only to send profits elsewhere by night. This, he explained, was not accidental, but structural. Without ownership, there could be no lasting stability. Reinvestment was not just about money. It was about confidence, skills, and long-term vision. He encouraged people to see small beginnings not as limitations, but as foundations. Every large institution, he reminded them, started with modest steps and deliberate planning. Entrepreneurship, so in Malcolm's message, was not about individual wealth or personal status. It was about collective resilience. When businesses were owned locally, they created jobs, circulated resources, decleansed, and reduced dependency. More importantly, they offered a sense of agency, proving that communities could shape their own future rather than wait for approval or assistance. This shift in mindset was central to his philosophy. Self-sufficiency, he believed, was learned through action, not theory. Malcolm also warned against confusing integration with empowerment. Participation without control, he argued, often led to exploitation rather than equality. True inclusion meant having a voice in decisions and a stake in outcomes. Without economic leverage, political influence remained fragile, easily ignored or overridden. By linking politics and economics, Malcolm emphasized that dignity required both representation and resources. This perspective fits seamlessly into the broader narrative he had been building. Awareness led to unity. Unity demanded transformation, and transformation required structure. Political control and economic self-sufficiency were not endpoints, but mechanisms through which freedom could be protected and expanded. Malcolm was clear that these goals required discipline, education, and patience, but he insisted they were achievable. Through this lens, Malcolm X reframed empowerment as a daily practice rather than a distant dream. He challenged people to think locally, act collectively, and invest intentionally. His message was not rooted in resentment, but in responsibility. By advocating ownership, reinvestment, and entrepreneurship, he offered a vision of strength grounded in self-respect and sustainability, reinforcing the idea that true freedom must be built from within. In the final chapter of Malcolm X's journey, his vision expanded beyond borders, beyond nations, and beyond the limits that had long confined the conversation. He understood that the struggle faced by Black Americans could not be fully explained or resolved within the language of domestic politics alone. By reframing it as a human rights issue, Malcolm shifted the narrative from a local dispute to a global moral question, one that demanded the attention of the world. He spoke with clarity about this shift. Civil rights, he argued, were granted and interpreted by governments, but human rights were inherent, universal, and undeniable. When injustice was defined only as a domestic concern, it could be delayed, negotiated, or dismissed. But when framed as a violation of human rights, it became part of a global standard, subject to international scrutiny and moral accountability. This was not a rhetorical move. It was a strategic and philosophical one, grounded in his understanding of history and power. Malcolm's decision to bring the Black American struggle to the world stage reflected everything he had learned along the way. His personal awakening taught him the importance of knowledge. Unity showed him the strength of collective identity. His distinction between reform and revolution sharpened his sense of what real change required. Political and economic self-determination revealed how power functioned in daily life. The global perspective was the culmination of these insights, tying them together into a vision that refused to be confined. By connecting the experiences of Black Americans with those of oppressed people across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Malcolm placed the struggle within a shared human story. He spoke not of isolation, but of solidarity, not of grievance alone, but of dignity. In doing so, he challenged the world to see patterns rather than exceptions, systems rather than incidents. His message resonated because it was rooted in truth, spoken with courage, and carried by lived experience. This global framing ensured that Malcolm X's voice would not fade with time. His ideas traveled across generations, influencing thinkers, campaigners, activists, and movements that continue to challenge injustice in many forms. His legacy is not defined by a single speech or moment, but by a framework for understanding power, identity, and responsibility. He left behind more than words. He left behind a way of seeing. As this story comes to a close, it becomes clear that Malcolm X was not speaking only to his own era. He was speaking forward, to anyone willing to question, learn, and act with integrity. His message reminds us that justice is not passive, freedom is not automatic, and progress is never guaranteed without effort. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and engage with this story. If you found value in revisiting Malcolm X's ideas and their relevance today, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and continue exploring history that challenges, informs, and inspires. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and ensures that voices like Malcolm X are never buried again.